Well, it's time now to take a look at the weather forecast here for the week ahead as we work through the month of May. Joining us now, Eric Snodgrass with Nutrien. And Eric, first off, I think we got to start and back up and look at this past weekend and the beginning of the week. Plenty of severe weather in many areas, plenty of rainfall in many areas, although feels like that rain was a bit disorganized working throughout the country, but still, nonetheless, plenty that we saw over the last, say, 72 hours here, Eric.
Yeah, what it was more like a midsummer setup. And what I mean by that is jet stream flow was relatively weak. It came out of the southwest. Normally, whenever we see southwest jet stream flow, we're talking in spring, good chances for opening the Gulf and lots of storms. But if you don't have a big low pressure system or a strong front, then they're just going to go wherever they're going to go. They'll feed on the heat of the day, they'll blow up, and then they regenerate new storms with their own outflows. So last week I was sitting here going, listen, I cannot tell you where it's going to storm, but it's going to storm in a lot of places. We're probably going to end up getting through the weekend and see a map like this one. And some folks can be like, man, you got 2 to 3 inches over 3 days. It's incredible. And then a county over, there was some guy that didn't get anything. The good news is that the pattern hasn't shut off yet. We still have, several more days of this lined up throughout this week, but there were a lot of places throughout the Corn Belt, soybean belt that got much needed moisture for the beginning of this season. It's going to buy a lot of time later on because that water is soaking down pretty deep, given that we've just worked the fields over. So you actually get a little bit better percolation after that versus when you're coming out of the end of the year having yet to do any field work. So it's a little different setup. So overall, I think a lot of people are going to be happy, maybe more happy people than there are going to be mad about this weekend's precip. I say that and then remember how much hail we had over the weekend as well. So many of these storms were just tossing out hailstones, some as big as softballs. And, you can just see the streaks across the country here that had hail. I'd be really worried about this if it would have been later in the season, but we still have a chance for some of those fields that were hit too hard for a replant. But this was, you're right, it was stormy. And I don't know about you, but man, I did not get much sleep on Saturday night. I just stayed up and listened to the thunder all night long. It was both a blessing and a curse. I needed that that sleep for Sunday, but boy, I was enjoying hearing the rain and hearing the thunder.
Very, very true. Well, and I look at the rainfall map as well, and I know that some of those dry areas in eastern Nebraska and into western Iowa, central Iowa, getting some pretty timely rains to help out with some of that dryness is there. I do look at the rainfall map though, and I point out parts of southeast South Dakota, kind of the northern two tiers of counties in Iowa, and then into southern Wisconsin. Didn't kind of caught a window there, didn't quite catch as much rainfall. So I don't know if those are areas we need to be concerned about quite yet or not, but just an observation for me looking at the last 72 hours of rainfall, Eric.
Yeah, not quite yet. Soil moisture there was actually better than it was in other places. And, we had some of the spring snow melt from about a month ago actually keeping the soil up there. So overall, I don't think that you're going to hear a complaint just yet from those folks, especially when you see the forecast and see that there's more storms coming this week. So we should be able to pump some more moisture back into those places and get better chances for rain there.
Sure, sure. How about growing degree days? Let's touch on those real quick here as well. Obviously, we're continuing to watch those as we build here into the month of May. Any observations for you with GDDs right now?
Yeah, I mean, Minneapolis up to 113 GDDs this next week. So we can tell that we're both pulling in some heat pretty far to the north. And therefore, I mean, just think about it. If you planted some corn yesterday, if you're able to get in, you could have emergence inside of a week in parts of Iowa, northern Illinois, maybe up in southern Minnesota, getting close to 120 GDDs. Now, south of there, we got the heat on. I mean, it's going to be hot and steamy, and it's going to be uncomfortable for us. But, early season conditions for this crop that's in there, that's going to accumulate quite a bit of heat units in here in the next several weeks. Where it's cold is out west right now. But the west is about to transition and bring in some extreme heat into parts of the Canadian prairie, the western Canadian prairie, and then the northwestern United States, kind of like the Pacific Northwest. And I'm sure you saw this, but there were some huge wildfires over the weekend in Alberta. This heat going back into that area at the end of this week and for most of the rest of May, it's got me concerned. I'm really worried about that area starting off with such hot temperatures after what was a very cold April. So, boy, we just flipped the switch in the Northwest.
Definitely did just flip the switch. As far as the week ahead, I know you touched on a little bit, but I can kind of tie this in, I think, as well with the El Nino outlook for the summer. what are we looking at for some of these windows to try and get into the field? I feel like maybe early this week there's not going to be a whole lot of activity, but maybe later this week we can get into the field here and get this crop in the ground ahead of what is sounding like more and more is going to be an El Nino type growing season, Eric.
Yeah, I think a lot of growers that are going to work to get a crop planted this week and next week are going to be staring at their favorite weather information source. I hope it's mine, but whatever it is, you live in like 24 hours by 24 hours, right? It's just to see when the storms are coming through. A lot of just keeping an eye on live radar to know if we've got a window that's opening up, because we're all positioned and ready to go. It's just dodging the storms. Getting into next week, though, the week 2 forecast, we're a bit drier. The wettest conditions are down south. Texas may have parts of south central Texas pick up 5 to 7 inches of rainfall. I mean, talk about busting a drought in certain places. Could be very wet. And overall, I think the moisture is pretty good for a lot of places in the country going forward. But, what does it bias? Does it bias 2 to 3 weeks? Possibly. We're not fully yet done with worrying about longer term things. And you brought up El Nino. And for most people that are listening to us right now, El Nino is probably a pretty good signal. Like, we love El Nino, tends to bring in better storm systems, juicier, tends to pump the atmosphere full of a little bit of heat. And that's what lets it ignite to build these storms. And we love those storms in the middle of summer, unless they go severe. But at this point, we still have this cold water off the West Coast that needs to fade quickly if you're in the Midwestern United States. And the latest model information suggests that that we could be looking at a strong to maybe a very strong El Nino by late summer. It's got to build there, though. And so as it builds in that direction, we could get the benefits of that in the Midwestern United States. Newest long-range data out from the European model. It's always the first one to come out at the beginning of every month. They still have most of the primary corn and soybean belt having northwest jet stream flow in summer, which results in thunderstorm activity built on Gulf moisture, and we just tend to do better. So right now, we're sitting here looking at all these long-range forecasts. The models say, let El Nino win. But in the back of my mind, there's still what we call the negative PDO signal. That's the cold water off the West Coast. And those two things compete. Whichever one wins determines the precipitation pattern overall for this summer. And right now, we just think El Nino's on top.
Eric, before we let you go, any other thoughts you want to share? Anything else? South America, Europe, anything you're watching there?
Well, South America had a major dry trend in the models over the weekend. Now, it's May. It's supposed to be getting dry in South America, but to see it this much drier than normal just has me worried that if you have some late planted safrinha corn, does it finish with enough moisture here at this midpoint of May such that by the time you get into June and they're harvesting it, we didn't take the top end off the yield? So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some more chatter about what's going on in South America, just cutting the monsoon off pretty quickly here. But we know that up to this point, that safrinha crop was large and looked pretty good from space when we look at NDVI imagery. Outside of that, it's been quite cold in parts of Australia, but I mean, it's fall. It's actually, they want me to call it autumn. I called it fall there once, and they're like, nope, you save that for the States. We call it autumn here. I said, okay. So yeah, they're going into a kind of a colder time period right now. Something to keep an eye on. You're right. Parts of Europe, we've seen very hot conditions in Spain, Portugal. They're still hot now, but you get over to Ukraine, it's a bit cooler. So they're having a bit of a cool spring, not packing in the heat right away.
Well, folks can sign up for Eric's daily weather newsletter, info.nutrien.com/Snodgrass_weather. And if you can't remember that, the link is in the video description and on our website, markettalkag.com. With that, Eric Snodgrass of Nutrien, always great to catch up with you, buddy. Have an awesome week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.